students, we are ready with our topic bread, with the objective of knowing the several ingredients required for producing bread, the brief process how bread can be produced in industries, and several types of bread which are enjoyed over the world. Let us see the first slide, which tells us briefly what bread actually is. Bread is usually made from wheat flour dough that is cultured with yeast, allowed to rise, and then finally baked in an oven. Now, the first bread that is in history, bread has been documented toward the prehistoric time, and early man probably was known to consume a food material which he prepared by using flour and water and then baked on hot stones. As time progressed, several modifications arose, and a lot of models and other things depicted in museums also tell us that bread was a staple kind of food consumed by many people. We can see here traditional bread making, which shows a simply stone has been placed and bread is baked on it. Now, moving on to the Roman time, approximately around 300 BC, Roman people knew how to make bread. Probably the bread that was used was a flat bread, unlike the ones that we consume today. Later, towards the 5th century, we can see a systematic or modernized form of bread making evolved. During the Middle Ages, the housewives generally used to take their dough to the bakers who used to bake the bread for them. After that, it was seen to be a common shop-like process which occurred, and people used to take their bread from the shops. Later, after the Industrial Revolution, it was the mode of the roller milling system, which we can see here, shows that the grains could be molded easily and grains were made into powder faster, and thus the appearance of faster bread production came into being. In 1961, the Corleywood bread process automated, and in Europe, especially in the US, we see this process and whiter bread could be procured from those times. Now, let us briefly understand the ingredients that we require for bread production. There can be two formulas, one a lean formula and another a premium formula. In the lean formula, which consists only of the flour, wheat flour, yeast and salt, they are commonly mixed together to produce the dough. In the case of premium formulas, along with the ones those are used in the lean ones, added oils or fats, eggs, milk can be taken. Now, discussing about the first ingredient, that is flour. What kind of flour should be used for bread production? Usually, the hard wheat varieties are chosen, although we have a wholemeal flour as well as gluten-free flour widely available nowadays for production of bread. Basically, the hard wheat varieties gives the best variety of bread. Now, wholemeal flour means kind of grain, the wheat grain, where the whole of the grain is ground and nothing is removed. If bread is produced from such kind of flour, it's called as a wholemeal flour. The third category of gluten-free flour is also becoming important nowadays because of gluten allergy. Now, people consuming bread can have gluten allergies, and they will be severely ill if such cases develop. And that is why these days gluten-free bread or gluten-free wheat producing bread is becoming very, very important. Obviously, actually wheat will always have gluten. We can reduce or remove the gluten from wheat, but there are other cereals like millet and sorghum chosen for production of gluten-free bread. This picture depicts actually the work and the necessity of gluten in bread production. Actually discussing, wheat consists of starch as well as protein. The starch may be approximately around 70 to 75%. The rest is protein. Now, in the starch, obviously, is the food for the yeasts, of the ones used for leavening, and the structure of whole of the bread comes partly from the starch. what does this gluten do? This gluten actually forms the crumb and finally gives the shape to the bread. How is this gluten formed? Bread protein actually can be divided into 5 different categories. The more important 4 prominent ones are shown here: albumins, globulins, gliadins and glutenins. Now when wheat flour is taken and dough is produced by mixing water, we have the production of wheat starch and wheat gluten. Basically they will separate. Now the formation of gluten can be observed here. This is composed of the 2 water-insoluble components, glutenin and gliadin protein. These 2 are present in wheat. Now, when water is added to it, generally there is a network or a complex formation consisting of both glutenin and gliadin. You can see here the long strands of glutenin incorporates this bead-like structures of gliadin to give a network structure. This is called as gluten. So, when wheat flour is mixed with water and dough is kneaded, this gives rise to gluten. So this structure, as you can see here, will give rise to air pockets, and during baking, steaming and further generation of air by the leavening agents, these will increase in size, that is expand, and allow the deposition of air, which gives the bread its fluffy structure. The other ingredients required are water or some kind of liquid. Most often water is used. At times other liquids can also be used, like milk if it's a premium bread. Now what is the purpose of adding water or a liquid? There are so many roles. It should be added for the flour to be made into a paste firstly, then followed by protein should be absorbed. The starch must absorb water to produce the needed structure for the bread. Proteins should absorb liquid to form gluten, as has been already discussed. Then moisture is also should be present to dissolve ingredients during the baking process. Adding of baking powder should be mixed well, yeast cells should be mixed well, and the water that is used can also be converted into steam, which will give rise to the air pockets already formed and thus allow the sponginess or springiness in bread. The next ingredient is very important: leavening agents. Leavening means increase in the porosity or gas holding capacity of the bread being produced. Leavening can be done by 2 processes: chemical or biological. In the chemical process, we can use baking soda or baking powder for the leavening purpose, which will produce carbon dioxide gas, which will be entrapped in the gas vesicles already produced earlier. Coming to the first one, that is baking soda, actually it is sodium bicarbonate and it is an alkaline ingredient. So it must be neutralized with an acid component. It can be buttermilk, honey or molasses. This will neutralize the sodium bicarbonate, the alkaline agent, otherwise bread will become bitter. So these 2 are combined together and then allowed to be used in the wheat flour for the leavening purpose. The second in the list of the chemical leavening agent is baking powder. Here the powder is formulated in such a way that we do have sodium bicarbonate, that is the baking soda, as well as the acid producing agents like acid or an acid salt. This product, the powder, becomes the same thing as compared to the earlier one. Only thing we have is that we have a compact product. In the biological category, that is, the yeast cells are most often used for the baking purposes. This is for leavening. Now, we have a huge amount of discussion to be made with yeasts, but because we will be restricting ourselves only to the baking process here, we will see what yeast cells have to do during the baking. Yeast cells generally can ferment the sugars present in the substrate and give rise to carbon dioxide and ethanol. Now this is the principal agent, that is carbon dioxide, which is needed during the bread making process. So basically Saccharomyces cerevisiae, called as the baker's yeast, is often added as leavening agent. Now what is the difference if we add a chemical leavening agent and a biological leavening agent like the yeast cells? Obviously, yeast cells, because of their own metabolic activity, will generate some amount of other substances biochemical in nature, which will have some property of aroma giving and flavor giving. That is why bread which is produced by leavening with yeasts have better flavor and aroma than the ones which are chemically leavened. But there is a difference. Chemical leavening will result in faster bread production, while biological leavening takes a lot of time. So it is up to you to realize which is better for you, whether you go for flavor or you go for the faster process. Industry requires both, and as such, both processes are important and used depending on the need. In the industry, we generally use the two forms of yeast, dry yeast and compressed yeast. Mostly, bakers prefer compressed yeast for their baking process. This is a wet preparation, while this is a dry one. This takes some time to revive, while the wet ones are easier working and takes less time. So most often, compressed yeast, called as baker's yeast, found as packed loaves, are often used in the baking process for leavening. Other ingredients which may be added, like fat, most often can be added in the form of butter, margarine, other shortenings, or sometimes even simply oil. These have a tenderizing effect in the produced baked product. They also have some other effect, like they generally coat the flour particles and then they cause the dough structure to separate into layers. This will give a proper structure to the baked product. It also aids in leavening, and if fat is beaten, air bubbles are produced. Now, air bubbles are very much required in production of fluffiness or sponginess in bread. Somewhat similar effect is produced by eggs as well when eggs can be beaten. This also adds on to flavor and taste of the bread. Sugar and salt, not to mention, are very, very important during bread baking process, because a product, a food like bread, cannot taste bland. It should have some sweetness. Sometimes salt is also required to give the exact taste. So these can be added as and when required in the desired amounts. Now, we will be moving on to a brief process of how bread can be produced in the industry. This follows several steps, like mixing the ingredients first, then goes for the next stage of rising, typically the fermentation process, then a kneading step, followed by a second rising, and finally baking and cooling down the product. Let us see all of these steps individually in slight detail. First, when we are mixing the ingredients, which are generally wheat flour, water, salt, and the leavening agent, either chemical or biological. Now, as we have seen before, that addition of water will give rise to the formation of gluten. You can see here the mixing of ingredients which is taking place, and it will have the effect of distributing all these ingredients properly so that bread becomes homogeneous. Next step is of rising. We can actually see in the diagram what rising means. You can see the dough taken in the bowl, and you can see that the dough has increased in size. It has risen. That is why the term rising. And what happens actually is fermentation. Now, when we have mixed the yeast or the chemical agent used for leavening in the dough and kept it aside for some time, they will start on their work. The chemical agent or the yeast will start producing the CO2 gas, which will be getting trapped, and thus the size or the volume of the dough will increase. This is what exactly happens, and we can see here in the picture very well understood. Next step is kneading. Now, kneading actually means mixing it all together again. Once the dough has risen from the first rise, we will mix it all together again. Now, why is it required? Now, there may be sometimes uneven distribution of those gas or cells formed earlier, and as such, mixing will reduce or make the whole thing more even. Or for more homogeneity, we continue kneading for some time and then allow it to rest again, known as the second rising time. So the first thing is repeated again here, and you can see here the second rising, which further allows the leavening agent to work on and increase in the volume of the dough. This is the second rising, also known as proofing at times. Now this, as we can see here, after the second rising, the dough is ready to be baked in an oven. So this is actually an electron microscopic view of the dough that is before rising, before the second rising, where we can see large holes and small holes, while the gluten strand is formed in this way. While after 2 hours of rising, we see that the lattice of gluten has been properly formed, and this gives the proper structure to the bread. then followed by baking. Lot of things happens in the baking process, but the temperature actually provides the necessary changes. Now, following at the 40 degrees centigrade, as temperature is increased, carbon dioxide gas already produced by the leavening agents expands and increases the existing gas cells. Then at 46 degrees centigrade, yeast cells are killed. So yeast cells effectively do their work before all this while, and after this stage of 46 degrees centigrade and above, the yeast cells are not doing their work. Above 60 degrees centigrade, the crumb starts stabilizing, and at 74 degrees centigrade, gluten transforms into a rigid structure. After the baking step, basically the cooling step is followed, and there the whole of the baked product is taken out, followed by rapid cooling, packaged and kept for sale. With a view of this process, we will move on to briefly see what are the different types of bread available in the market world over. There are basically 4 types of processes which follow and bread is produced. We have a 5th one which is slightly different from all of these. The first 4 are the straight dough method for bread production, the sponge method, the brew process, the 4th one is the continuous mix process, finally the 5th different type of variety of the sourdough process. Moving on to the first one, straight dough. Here we will see exactly what happened, what we saw in the bread making process. All the ingredients are mixed all together, baked and given as a whole product. Now this is not very much always favored because this gives rise to less flavor and at times different hardy structure may be produced. So the sponge dough method is most often followed. What is done here is that approximately 60 to 70% of the ingredients are mixed and then allowed to ferment for some time. Then after the while, when the dough has risen, the rest of the ingredients are mixed. So we have a form of starter here basically, which can be used for bread production. This is evident in the diagram that the fermentation room is very important, and the dough is allowed to ferment, increase in size to approximately 4 to 5 times, and then rest ingredients are mixed. It can be divided, used for the proofing system or the second rising, and finally baked. The most advanced process in the US is of the continuous mix process, which employs automated computer-generated stages wherein most of the operations are carried out on conveyor belts and computer operated to generate faster, whiter bread. We move on to the last type, that is the sourdough method, where lot of other organisms are involved in the leavening process. This has been coming down from the ancient times, and the sourdough process still exists in the world. Now, basically, we see that here, other than yeast, there are lactobacilluses involved in the fermentation steps meant for leavening. And thus, the product that is produced is not only containing CO2, but also has other flavorful and aromatic compounds generated by the lactobacilluses. Not to forget, acid produced by the lactobacilluses gives the very name sourdough and a sour taste to all the bread products produced by this method. So with this, we come to an end of the topic. Although topic on bread is a never-ending one, we have so many different types. You can take the example of the plain roti or chapati or naan that we generally use at our home every day is also a form of bread. It's not leavened, it is an unleavened one, but the bread that we procure every day from the market is a leavened one, can be leavened by chemical agents or biological methods. Most often in our countries, we generally use a chemical method. It's a faster one, while more flavorful bread obviously should be leavened by the yeast cells. And we have also discussed about the sourdough method, which employs not only yeast but lactobacillus is another bacteria for the leavening part to allow more flavor and aroma into the baked product. Any food product is always welcome with more flavor and more aroma than having a bland taste.